Cities across the world are facing a sharp decrease in revenue from public transit. Many commuters are now working from home, and many are also avoiding public spaces for fear of the virus. Car sales are also up, which could have a detrimental effect on greenhouse gas emissions. For more, I want to bring in Somini Sengupta. She is an international climate reporter for the New York Times and has been reporting on this topic. Somini, how could this downturn of commuters using public transit impact climate change and even public health?
So here's what we found. All over the world, we found that passengers are staying away from buses and trains and trams. And sometimes, as you said, that's because they're working more from home. They're not moving around as much. And sometimes it's because they're fearful of the infection. And ridership numbers have really plummeted, and revenues have plummeted in really big cities that are almost synonymous with their public transit systems. So Rio, London, Paris, New York, public transit is just kind of hanging by a thread there. What does it have to do with climate change? Well, public transit offers a relatively simple way for cities to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the thing that's causing climate change. Transportation is usually a really big chunk of any city's greenhouse gas emissions. So having a modern public transit system is a relatively simple way of addressing that, not to mention air pollution, noise, the congestion that you get from, traffic jams. I live in a pretty busy neighborhood in New York City, and I can tell you, I definitely hear the roar of cars and trucks and motorcycles throughout the day. And I can definitely feel, the dust and soot that comes through my apartment windows.
Well, even before the pandemic, cities like ours, New York, were struggling to modernize transit systems. And now with ridership down, transit agencies are, as you write, simply trying to stay afloat. So do transportation officials actually have a recovery plan?
It's a really good question. What I'm hearing from a lot of transportation experts and transportation officials is that they need to figure out what the future of transportation looks like. So are people going to commute in the same hours, on the same days as they were before? How do you adjust subway and bus schedules accordingly? Can you create, in some cities there are bus-only lanes so that the buses aren't competing with cars. So can you create more bus-only lanes so that buses can move more smoothly? Will more cities impose what are called congestion taxes to keep gas and diesel burning cars and trucks out of the city center? Will cities expand bike lanes? Until you have answers to these questions, we don't really have a good sense of what public transit will look like. But we know that there are two main worries. One main worry is that people will just get into cars, right? And as you said, used car sales are up, and those used car sales are certainly not electric vehicles. That is true. We found not only in the United States, but in some other cities like Delhi, used car sales seem to be booming. So that's one worry, right? More cars on the road. The other worry is, well, are public transportation systems going to be able to invest what they need to make public transit safe, efficient, and ultimately attractive to people, for people to return on them? So it's a little bit of a, chicken and egg situation. And it's a really critical question for so many big cities around the world.
Yeah, not to mention that there are equity and access questions, too, because not everybody not only can afford those cars, but afford parking in those cities. But when you're talking about imagining the future of transportation, obviously what's really topical right now is President Biden is set to unveil a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan just next week. Do you believe that it could help U.S. transit systems modernize? And what do you hope to see from the federal government in the coming months?
Well, what we know already is that the Biden administration announced earlier this month an infusion of $30.5 billion of, emergency money. It's part of the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that was announced earlier this month. And that infusion of money for public transit is like the biggest, my colleagues reported earlier this month, really the biggest injection of money into public transit systems. So what does that mean? It means in the immediate future, service cuts, planned service cuts can be restored. So in DC, for example, Washington, DC said that they could keep open nearly 24 stations that they were considering closing now that they have this emergency money. New York said it would restore some of the commuter rail lines that bring in commuters from the suburbs into the city. So that's kind of an immediate injection of money that'll keep them afloat and that will prevent cuts and layoffs. But the bigger ticket item, obviously, is what happens to this big infrastructure bill as it makes its way through Congress in some fashion. So you heard the transportation secretary yesterday, yes, it was Thursday, say to a congressional committee that, to consider this a generational investment in public transit. That's what he called it, a quote, generational investment. The price tag of the infrastructure bill is anywhere between $3 and $4 trillion. About $1 trillion of that is to go into transportation. And the signals that we are hearing, that my colleagues in Washington are hearing from Republicans in Congress, is support for the roads and bridges part. So, one of the Republican members of Congress said that bill needs to be about roads and bridges. Whether that means some of that money can go into public transportation, we will find out in the coming days and weeks.
Well, really quickly, before I let you go, another thing that I appreciated about your most recent article was looking at this not just in terms of what's happening in the United States here, but you also look at it from a global perspective. So in the last couple of moments that we have remaining, can you talk to us about any outliers, other places that are actually taking advantage of this period to make sure that their public transportation system is cleaner and better and really looking at that future?
We've seen a couple of examples of cities that are trying to create more bike lanes, for example. We are seeing some cities continue with their plans to get electric buses on the road, which are less polluting, less noisy. And we are seeing, notably in cities like Shanghai, a return to public transit, largely because of the numbers are down and the economy has reopened.
All right. Somini Sengupta, thank you.
Thank you so much.